we now have our junta up here to form our decadal plan. Now, we've heard a lot about various technologies, both for power generation and integration. We've heard various launch systems, everything from chemical to superconducting, and which you guys need to be the gauge of the time frame for these things. Also, how we can manage, as they say in the military, no one ever managed a platoon to the top of a hill. We need some leadership. Okay, now I ask our junta here to tell us the plan, the decadal plan, based on everything you have heard for the last day and a half. Yeah, we're all going to be dead by the time this happens, so you're the only one who's going to be here, so you're the one who gets to plan it.
The object is to do it quick, so I won't be dead.
Sorry, Matt, hurry.
I'm going to reiterate a few thoughts that were already said before, but I think the key to being successful with this is defining a goal clearly. And in particular, a goal that's, so at this stage in our development, I don't think people are going to, there's not a very obvious goal like go to the moon in this decade. Like there, at least to my knowledge, there's nothing that's going to galvanize the entire population behind that. But what we can do is pick a few near-term goals that we know are going to get us toward a longer-term goal. And that's something that both industry and the government can bite off and sink their teeth into and actually put some resources behind it. At least based on what I've heard so far, and from my sort of, my tendency is to look at this from the pulling technology. And so like, there's two modes of making things like this happen. One is technology push and the other is pull. And there's a difference between them and a very key one, which is push is I have a technology and I want to find a use for it. Pull is I have a problem and I want to find a technology to solve it. The 21st century has really cast its ballot on the second approach, that you start with the problem and you bring a technology in to solve it. And I think that we're going to have to stick with that, at least for the near term, because there just aren't enough people with the other approach, which is what it used to be, the technology push mechanism. It used to be a lot more popular than it is, and it's just really hard to get momentum behind it. So what we really ought to do is pick a goal, and a goal can be a problem. And from my own perspective, I think the right problems to address are one of two, which are sustainable habitats and asteroid mining. If we can pick a goal in one of those, then both of those have near-term commercial applicability that I could guarantee I could go out and raise funding for. Because I can guarantee the thing that will kick off the space race, at least the second sort of generation of space race, at least as far as I can tell, is the first person who goes out and finds a platinum asteroid and brings something back, or even brings regolith and builds something in space, like either one, but both of those sort of hinge on asteroid mining. And then for sustainable infrastructure, there's need for that all over the world right now. And if you come up with technologies that can sustain human life, that is self-sustain human life on the planet as a stepping stone to doing it in outer space, that's again a market that you could go after right now and sell that technology here and now as a stepping stone to what you would go into the future. So those, if I was a dictator, I would have people choose between those two at least, which is not completely a dictatorship, but I think those two are both equally feasible goals that should be what we focus our energy on, because those are stepping stones in the right direction that can get funding now and that can have market applicability now.
I listened to this through a strange filter because of my age, and everything I hear is like newspeak in a way, because the old way of doing things that got us to the moon and got the Manhattan Project built was that we had a very few really intelligent, informed decision makers, and they were well aware that there was a variety of possibilities, different approaches to any problem, like the elements that Dean has been describing. But to cut through the clutter, they didn't have to analyze the thing in detail. They more or less by the seat of the pants, decided this seems more practical and expeditious than the other. But hey, by the way, to be careful, maybe we should do 2 or 3 things in parallel and find out pretty soon. And that was the way that you develop kind of test platforms. And I think tomorrow morning, probably from Mark Uran, you'll hear the spirit of that idea that what we're really looking at is having to quickly, if we're going to do something in a decade, we've got to quickly establish a set of test platforms that revolve around what is known and what people will believe and what's affordable, and then make decisions up front. Okay, we're going to cover possible failure by having 2 or 3 prongs, but the probability is at least 30% that one of them is going to work, and therefore you can go forward with pretty much confidence that you're going to get there. And I believe that we need a lot of that spirit, that things have gotten so bureaucratized and so complicated with the current way of doing things that you get lost in the details. And I always like the definition of a camel as a horse built by a committee, and I think that there's some wisdom in that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the key here would be to find a goal that can unify people. Like I personally, I think my favorite sort of long-term goal would be setting up a lunar base, because it makes the most sense. It's a good place to stage everything afterwards. And we start with that, and from that break it down into achievable bite-sized chunks. Like I think in the past it was a lot, so first off, if you just look at the ratio of PhD holders to funding and plot that versus time, you'll find that it is highly unfavorable at this point in history, which is just means that there are a lot of really smart, educated, highly competent people competing for a smaller pot of money, like just divided amongst it. And the natural result of that is not all bad, but the current iteration of it is bad. That what's been asked of researchers now is to come up, for example, ahead of time with the commercialization goal or whatever, and I don't think that doesn't align well with the idea behind science broadly, that we're exploring. And I would argue that almost all of the key revolutionary discoveries, the transistor, most recently CRISPR, all of these came out of just basic science pursuits under a common goal of understanding a particular space. In this case, if what we want to set as our goal is to set up a lunar base, then we have that in our heads and we know what's there, but we also know some of the things that need to happen first. And so we set goals for those near-term things and figure out, okay, how can we solve this problem and where else is it useful? But not doing it from a top-down, letting the people who are doing the research at the end of the day decide the direction, because they are going to be the ones doing a better job. As long as they're going in the right general direction, having less bureaucracy and having sort of full control over the projects in the hands of the people who are working on it, I feel like is the right way to do it. But we need to start with goals, no matter what. Like there needs to be a long-term goal and then several short-term goals on the way there, or we're all working in different directions and it won't get anywhere.
But isn't that what's happening in SpaceX, for example? They have a czar, and he's deciding what's going to happen, and he's got his dedicated people who are doing it within that closed system.
Is this a two-person conversation, or can anybody butt in?
Yeah.
I was just waiting for somebody to bring up the fact that this isn't like when Kennedy was president and he could say, this is the objective, this is the goal, this is the mission, and there weren't any other voices in the room. Right now, yes, we've got the U.S. government, we've got NASA, and there's, they're kind of the large gorilla in the room, but SpaceX, Blue Origin, whoever else, they've got a voice too, and they may declare that they're doing something else. And that's not going to be something that is controllable purely from a governmental perspective. So it may be influence, but it's not quite the same thing as when Kennedy could just say, this is what we're doing.
So I'm gonna speak to all three comments. I agree fully with the idea that form follows function, and you should have a goal in order to effectively organize any large-scale effort at innovation. But I'm also going to agree with John that that there were some people 50 years ago who really were towering intellects and had access to the decision makers. But I'll comment that those people, like von Braun, had in their mind specific goals that they'd been thinking about and had already gotten started on. So they're not independent paths. And in terms of right now, I will disagree that a moon base is the goal. And I do that referring back to my comments of yesterday. Again, if you look at the data, there is a swarm of missions going to the moon over the next handful of years, 5, 6, 7 years. They're not going to set up a base. They're going for economic gain. They're prospecting, they're looking for resources, they're looking to extend the economic activity of their company or their country to the moon. And we, the United States, are now playing catch-up. But I think that human activities and presence on the moon will follow, but I think that the real driver is going to be, if you wanted to state it in a sentence fragment, the extension of the terrestrial economy to the moon and cislunar space and all that entails.
Well, if I can jump in here for just a moment, I'd like to point out to Matt that you may be putting the cart before the horse in terms of, all right, what we need is the goal. The goal is not the first thing. The first thing is the need. Okay, we didn't, in 1919, we didn't have the technology to build the Hoover Dam. And in 1929, we didn't have the technology to build a bridge across the Golden Gate. In 1939, we didn't have the technology to harness the atom. And in 1961, we didn't have the technology to go to the moon. But in each case, there was a perceived need, and so the goal was set to do these things. And the writer J.M. Straczynski once wrote that the universe works on a complex interaction between mass energy and enlightened self-interest. And so oftentimes the need is the personification of that in enlightened self-interest. And so if we can define that, then we can, as you say, pull the process along and pull those people to us.
Well, sometimes you don't have to have a need. You may just have a want, and that will do just as well, particularly if people can see ways of making money from it. But one of the things that I get really allergic to is the idea of the stakeholder, which seems to be a universal thing going now. And you try to get everybody involved who might have any interest in it, set up committees, and then have the government negotiate between that. And that ends up just being entropy and nothing gets done. One of the directors of Ames, I think it was about 30 years ago, was diagnosing basically the total freezing up of NASA at some point, whereas a number of missions got fewer and fewer, they got bigger and bigger, and they came so far apart that you had to have all the centers involved, and then all of them had to negotiate apart for themselves, and the fights between them had to be settled up at headquarters. Now you're going to expand that same methodology and bring in the whole civilian things, and nothing is going to get done. You got to turn a lot of the independent players and let them, take off on their own and get something done, and see who wins and who loses.
And yes, I want to start off also, your statement was what I was going for, but in my ignorance did not deliver as well. Really, and you hit the point on perfectly, I think, which is that what we need to do is expand our economy outside of the surface of the earth at the end of the day. That's the goal, because that's what will get everybody behind it. That aligns financial incentives, that aligns everybody who's working on it. It makes it really clear what you're working on. It's really the best way to do it. And and I also agree with what you were saying. Actually, I misspoke a little bit there, which the idea behind technology pull is to find a need and develop a goal from it. So I agree with you completely, and not making that clear is my fault. It's really, you start with a need that people have, which in this case is economic growth, I think is the way to go after it. It's the message right now, for better or worse, that resonates with people. And so we need to address it, because that's what people are going to want to hear. And the way to do that is to say, hey, look, there is nearly infinite groups of resources up there that we can address, that we can bring back to Earth and bring to drive economic engines, or keep up in space to drive economic engines. That will get everybody excited about it, and in turn will generate the sort of interest and investment that we need to make it actually happen.
Very well said, Matt. I agree completely. Here's a question for you. There are various vested interests that could have a say for positive or negative. For example, the oil industry may have something to say about these solar panel satellites. I was hearing somebody talking yesterday about breaking up the power grids. Well, what do the power grid people have to say about that? So again, how would you, I'm talking to the whole panel here, incentivize these special interests in your direction? I think of James Webb as the administrator of NASA, who put together the coalition for NASA. He had parts of the Apollo project being built in every state and funneling money into all the aerospace industries and so forth. Basically, how would you go about talking Standard Oil into building solar panel satellites?
So I don't have a lot of knowledge about the energy industry, but the little bit I do know, I don't think that will be a huge barrier to entry for this. And in fact, I think they could be a big ally. I know that Shell and BP have some of the largest investments on the planet in renewable energy, because they know that eventually, no telling when, eventually the economics for oil are not going to work out in their favor. They're an energy company, not an oil company at the end of the day. Now that said, if you have something that's going to drastically disrupt their profits today, and it's not something that's going to grow in to fill a gap that they're having, that would be a problem. But I don't think that the growth rate is going to be so high as to threaten them. Contrary to that, I think they would actually be willing to invest in it. So I wouldn't see them as an enemy in this space, as long as it's pitched to them properly.
Yes.
So I actually got invited to go to ExxonMobil outside of Dallas to talk about solar power satellites, about 8 years ago. And I had a really nice visit. They had if you haven't been there, they have a beautiful headquarters, huge complex. About 200 people work there, and the rest of the place is empty. It's like a ghost town, because, I don't know, 20 years ago they made a decision to decentralize and send their corporate leaders all over the planet, and only a very few of them stayed at headquarters. They're not a monolith. The radical difference between how ExxonMobil saw its future about a decade ago versus BP. BP made the decision, we're an energy company, and they pursued that. ExxonMobil said, well, we're going to also be a chemical company. And they pursued that, because that's what another thing they could do with the feedstock, that they happen to be highly skilled in finding, extracting, and distilling. So they're by no means monolithic. And some of them are going to oppose new energy sources because they're in they're trains. They're running trains. They're not in the transportation business. And others are going to embrace it. And I think, but I will say the guy that I talked to, who was a very senior strategic planning there and was very thoughtful, and 2 years later he was gone. I mean, he left and went to work for another company.
Yeah, maybe the best analog to the threat of space power is the fracking revolution. And you saw that got accepted. Everyone tried to get ahead of the game, and it's just taken off, unless, of course, you're in Germany or Australia, which is well regulated.
If you look at what's happened to West Texas, you then take the assertions that were made about contaminating L4 and L5 seriously, and that's West Texas in 3 dimensions if you don't do it right.
Wind power?
No, I'm talking about the whole place smells of methane, and it's the visual damage that's been done to that beautiful, huge area is profound.
So wrapping things up, what has our junta decided on well, what we should be doing in the next 2 years, 5 years, 8 years, 10 years? Ma'am?
I have an opinion, but I'd like to hear yours. No, mine isn't realistic, and yours is.
I'll just reiterate, I think what we need to do, folks in this room who are significantly smarter than me should get together and figure out how you can make the largest positive economic impact and highest growth rate of the space economy and set a goal that will be commensurate with that. That's what will get the most interest at this particular point in history, and I also think is actually a good thing, because at the end of the day, as we say on the healthcare side, which is my main company that I spend most of my time on, no money, no mission. You need to set a feedback loop, a virtuous cycle that generates cash that is reinvested into the same economy from which it was generated, which has not yet happened with space particularly.
But
You want to set that cycle up.
I would suggest, though, you're saying the most interest from the standpoint of money and power that would get it done, but I think the key is what will get the most interest between 20-year-old blue-collar workers who like the prospect. Dean Hartley pointed out this a good while back, that you need a frontier, you need a challenge, you need something new and wonderful to go after, and okay, it has some risk, but you're willing to take the risk to be there and be part of it. And I believe that the real interest you need to generate is in the grassroots, and that's.
I'm glad you brought that up. The argument wasn't so much that would cause people to support the space endeavors, but that we need it for our national mental health, in the sense that you've seen the experiments about rats that have been cooped up in small spaces and they go crazy. And even if you have some kind of outlet, psychologically it allows the people who don't want to go into space to feel better, because they know somebody can go into space. There's a frontier out there that allows people to feel less constrained, more energized, as I say, even if they personally aren't the ones who are interested in doing it. They just think things are better, and that's a mental health problem that I think that we need to address by doing what we're talking about.
You pointed out in 1750 they was similar.
Yeah, there was, I had a friend when I worked at the lab who was of Scandinavian extraction, and I asked her, why did all her ex-relatives go to places like Nebraska and Wisconsin, and they were really cold and miserable places. There's a book that we had to read in high school called Giants in the Earth that was the most dismal description of life on the prairie for those pioneers that got their square given to them. And I said, why did your ancestors do that? And she said, well, they all came from, I think she was Norwegian, from Norway, where the land is, there's lots of mountains, but the arable land is constrained. And so an ancestor had a plot yay big, and he had 2 sons, and it was divided in half, and they had 2 sons, and now it's divided in fourths. And by the time we got to the migration time, nobody had enough land to do anything with. So hearing that you could get free land in America,
Full quarter section.
a full quarter section, was It didn't matter where. They were coming, and they did come. And it made a tremendous difference to the psyche of the United States.
Right, and as you pointed out, a lot of people, most of the people stayed in the cities in the eastern United States, the strip along the East Coast, and a few pioneers went out there, but the ones that stayed felt really good because they knew that, well, it's there and I can always go if I decide that I want to.
Well, there was another example in relatively recent history, about 1990, when President Bush the Elder was in there and his OMB director, Darman. They had just no interest in space whatsoever, but they had recognized that, looking back at the Apollo, what it did for the nation in terms of getting people into engineering and stuff like that. And so they threw their entire weight behind it. At the time, the technology was just not there. You know, NASA proposed going to Mars at, $700 billion or $700 million a trip. So, it just kind of fell flat. But now the technology is there. I think that's one of the things that could get the government really interested in it. It's not the specific goal, but what it can do for the country and the education system in general.
So I just wanted to make the observation that, does anybody actually live on a quarter section? So I do. I live on a quarter section that was homesteaded by my great-grandfather, who came and homesteaded it under the Homestead Act. It was previously a Spanish land grant in California. And so and I still live there today, and so I'm very, very much familiar with that. He was exceptionally lucky in getting a place with a good water table, which is essential, because without water you can't do anything. And I am reminded in telling that story of the Valley of Death. And I think, so thinking about the next couple of years and trying to put together some kind of a thing that could be done. So it's fairly easy, and I think as was articulated by the gentleman from Hoyt Tether, you can go in and you can get some NIAC money, and that's one of the things that Joel Strzezel had done. And you can get probably an SBIR, and there are small companies that are nice and innovative, and they make their living getting SBIRs. It's $250K here and $1 million there, and then they do it again, and they do it over the years, and they have this nice little firm that goes along in perpetuity, but you never get to the point of actually starting a fire. By that I mean leading to a real systems level transformation in anything. And the dilemma is, where do you find the investment kitty, the money that's targeting on a handful of problems that would make a real difference, that would spend 20 or 30 or 40 million, not a few $100K or $1 million. And the whole feedback loop in the space community is so ingrained with the SBIR culture. And NIAC is a fine thing. No negatives to NIAC. I got money from NIAC and I was happy to have it. But it doesn't, there's no track like there would be, and DARPA is a really good example, where if you get a seedling at DARPA and it goes well, you get 2 or 3 seedlings together and all of a sudden it's a $50 million program. And there's an opportunity for a systems level demo. And if you're working on a problem that matters, something can happen from it. I really had hopes that that was going to be what Starshop did, because Milner was talking about putting up $100 million. And it seemed to me that was enough money that if he really put it in there, that you have a chance to win big. And I think that's one of the things that's really lacking. The other's easy, but unless you're willing to pull in your horns and go work on Earth observing satellites, when you're an asteroid resource company, and I'm not naming any companies, but you're going to, because you can't get money to go through that, you're going to do something else that you can get money for. It dilutes all of the momentum that you've got a bunch of excited guys with real talent, and they could go off and do something really meaningful, but the system's not supporting it. So I think if that was part of our finding, and if there's an agreement on that issue, I think that would be a useful thing to put forward.
Feel free to tell people to increase NIAC's budget.
Have to wait. Okay.
The fact that there is no NIAC Phase 3 is a huge issue. And there's no acceptance within the system that things that come out of NIAC Phase 2, by golly, they ought to somehow become tipping point projects. There's no machinery for that. That's a term of art within the Space Technology Directorate. But if there was, my God, people would be swarming NIAC, because this is how you get into the pipe to really make a transformational leap, but it doesn't exist.